What occurs when the world's most extensive sanctions regime not only fails to dismantle its target, but in fact strengthens it? I'm John Mearsheimer, and for over 40 years I've studied the ebb and flow of great powers. What I'm seeing right now challenges everything Western policymakers assumed about economic coercion. Professor Jeffrey Sachs has recently presented the most thorough critique of Western strategy I've ever encountered. His analysis is not hypothetical, it's a post-mortem of a strategy gone awry. The sanctions aimed at Russia have backfired so dramatically that they are reshaping global power structures. While Washington congratulates itself on tactical gains, Moscow is succeeding in an entirely different arena, and the West doesn't even realize it is losing. When Russia moved into Ukraine in February 2022, I observed Western leaders make a familiar fatal mistake I've seen time and again. They conflated moral indignation with sound strategic planning. The response was immediate and predictable, the most sweeping sanctions package in modern history. Asset freezes, financial exclusion, energy embargoes, technology restrictions. The objective was straightforward economic strangulation intended to topple the regime. From a realist perspective, I understood that this strategy rested on the perilous assumption that Russia had no alternatives. But Jeffrey Sachs recognized what I saw. The West was not fighting the conflict it believed it was waging. While NATO concentrated on military containment, Russia was engaged in a completely different campaign. The methodical erosion of Western economic supremacy was underway, and Putin was about to demonstrate that the foundation of American influence, dollar hegemony, was far more vulnerable than anyone had anticipated. The first shockwave hit within weeks. The ruble, which Western analysts had predicted would collapse into worthless currency, not only stabilized but actually gained strength. By late 2022, it had appreciated against the dollar. Russian GDP, projected to shrink by 15%, contracted only marginally before rebounding to growth figures that embarrassed Western economists who had staked their credibility on collapse forecasts. The regime, expected to buckle under domestic pressure, instead consolidated its power. Putin's approval ratings, rather than plummeting amid economic strain, remained unexpectedly resilient. The oligarchs, whom Western strategists assumed would rebel against the Kremlin, instead discovered new opportunities and rerouted trade flows. Yet these were not the true surprises. The real tectonic shift was structural. Sachs identified what he calls strategic adaptation, Russia's methodical pivot away from the West and toward what economists now refer to as the Global South Plus coalition. China, India, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Indonesia, the UAE, nations collectively representing over half of the world's population and a growing portion of global GDP. What struck me most was the velocity of this realignment. Trade relationships that normally required decades to cultivate were established in mere months. Bilateral trade between Russia and China surged 30% in the first year alone. India expanded its Russian oil imports by more than 700%. These were not short-term adjustments, but permanent shifts in the geography of the global economy. For decades, I have argued that in an anarchic international system, states will balance against dominant powers. What unfolded from 2022 to 2024 was the fastest great power realignment in modern history. And the catalyst was not Russian aggression, it was Western overreach. The energy equation illustrates this perfectly. Europe, in a fit of what Sachs describes as moral arrogance, severed its reliance on inexpensive Russian gas almost overnight. The economic fallout was immediate and devastating. German factories shutting by the hundreds, French industries relocating to America and Asia, European competitiveness evaporating in months, energy costs tripled and then quadrupled in some regions. nudging major manufacturers toward American markets where subsidies and cheaper energy awaited. Entire supply chains collapsed before my eyes. Chemical plants that had been profitable for decades became unviable. Steel production, the backbone of European industry, fell by double digits. And the automotive sector, already strained by the transition to electric vehicles, faced additional energy costs that made it less competitive against Asian rivals. Meanwhile, Russia redirected its energy flows eastward with remarkable efficiency. Chinese imports of Russian oil reached record levels, with Beijing securing long-term contracts at discounted rates. India became Moscow's largest client outside China, boosting purchases by over 1,000% within 18 months. Even traditional U.S. allies such as Turkey quietly expanded energy imports from Russia. The most consequential development, however, was the construction of new pipeline infrastructure. The power of Siberia expansion, new routes through Central Asia, and LNG facilities aimed at Asian markets. Russia was physically reconfiguring the global energy network away from Europe. The energy map of Eurasia was redrawn in months, not decades. Europe, having voluntarily sacrificed energy security for symbolic moral gestures, found itself permanently weakened in global manufacturing. But energy was only the beginning. The deeper transformation threatens American hegemony at an even more fundamental level: the dollar system itself. For 80 years, the United States has enjoyed what economists term exorbitant privilege, the ability to print currency that other nations must accept because global trade relies on dollars. This system enabled the U.S. to finance enormous deficits, sustain a global military footprint, and wield sanctions as a potent weapon. Sachs warns that this era is ending, not through military defeat, but through systemic circumvention. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have accelerated the creation of alternative payment mechanisms. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is expanding its financial infrastructure. Significantly, major oil producers are accepting payments in yuan, rubles, and even rupees rather than dollars. The numbers are striking. In 2021, approximately 2% of Russia-China trade occurred in domestic currencies. By 2024, that proportion had surpassed 75%. Saudi Arabia, America's oldest Middle Eastern ally, began accepting yuan for Chinese oil, a development unthinkable only a few years ago. The 2023 BRICS Plus expansion incorporated Iran, Egypt, UAE, and Ethiopia, while dozens of other nations applied for membership. This was not merely symbolic diplomacy. It marked the institutionalization of a non-Western financial infrastructure, a new development bank as an alternative to the World Bank, and the BRICS payment system challenging SWIFT's dominance. Each bilateral trade agreement conducted outside the dollar system represents a small fissure in U.S. financial supremacy. Collectively, these cracks are revolutionary. When enough nations transact without dollars, the very foundation of American economic power begins to crumble. I've calculated the mathematics of this decline. Should only 30% of global trade shift away from dollar denomination, the United States would lose the capacity to fund its vast deficits through monetary expansion. The consequences would entail enforced fiscal austerity, curtailed military spending, and fundamental restructuring of America's global obligations. I've observed this process with the analytical detachment demanded by my realist training, yet with increasing unease. Sachs is describing more than an economic transition. He is revealing the emergence of a truly multipolar world order. And historically, such transformations are rarely peaceful. The tragedy is that this outcome could have been entirely avoided. After the Cold War, the West had a chance to build an inclusive international system reflecting new realities. Instead, it doubled down on dominance, NATO expansion, economic coercion, and regime change operations, all designed to preserve a unipolar moment that was always destined to be temporary. Russia's endurance under maximum pressure has sent a powerful message worldwide. The West's economic tools have limits. If Moscow can withstand the harshest sanctions in history and emerge more self-reliant, why should any other nation fear Western economic coercion? This realization is spreading faster than any sanction could hope to contain. From Africa to Asia, Latin America to the Middle East, governments are quietly diversifying partnerships, reducing dependence on the dollar, and cultivating relations with non-Western powers. I've witnessed this transformation firsthand at academic conferences and policy forums. Officials from countries across the global South openly discuss hedging strategies, maintaining ties with the West while simultaneously expanding alternatives. Nigeria explores yuan-denominated oil sales, Angola experiments with trade agreements outside the dollar, and Malaysia actively negotiates barter and local currency settlements for critical imports. Across continents, similar adjustments are being quietly implemented. Governments understand that the economic leverage the West once wielded is no longer absolute. The emergence of alternative financial architectures, new supply chains, and energy networks signals a profound reordering of global power. This is the new reality. The sanctions that were supposed to break Russia instead accelerated its integration with rising powers and the global South. Economic coercion, long considered a blunt but effective instrument of Western strategy, has been revealed as a limited and fragile tool. As nations diversify trade, shift currency use, and build parallel financial systems, the West confronts the daunting prospect of diminished influence not through battlefield defeat, but through the quiet, relentless transformation of the international order. The world is entering a multipolar era faster than anyone anticipated, and those who misread the implications of sanctions are discovering that power, once assumed permanent, is far more transient than theory suggested. Bangladesh is expanding rupee-based trade with India. Argentina is seriously considering joining the BRICS group. The trend is unmistakable. Nations are quietly preparing for a post-American global order, not through abrupt revolution, but through a steady decoupling from Western-dominated systems. Sanctions refers to this as the awakening of sovereignty, a moment when nations realize they have genuine choices. The monopolar era, where Washington set the rules, is giving way to a multipolar reality in which power is shared among multiple centers. Yet the transformation is more than just economic. It is psychological, cultural, and civilizational. For the past 30 years, Western values, institutions, and models of development were presented as universal and inevitable. Today, alternative paths to prosperity and governance are proving not only feasible, but effective. China's Belt and Road Initiative has connected more than 140 countries through infrastructure projects exceeding $1 trillion. Unlike Western development aid, which often comes with political stipulations regarding governance and economic reforms, Chinese investments prioritize tangible infrastructure, ports, railways, and telecommunications networks. The outcomes are visible across the developing world. African cities are linked by Chinese-built railways. Central Asian states are connected through energy pipelines. South American nations now access Pacific markets via Chinese-financed ports. Europe emerges as the largest loser in this global transition. By surrendering strategic autonomy to American leadership, European nations now find themselves without the military capacity to defend their interests or the economic flexibility to adjust. The continent that once commanded global influence has become a strategic backwater, dependent on American energy at costs 3 times higher than Russian alternatives they voluntarily abandoned. The psychological impact is deeper than mere economics. For decades, Western elites assumed their model was inevitable, their values universal, and their global dominance permanent. Sachs dismantles these illusions with methodical precision. The world no longer requires Western permission to thrive. Alternative frameworks for development, governance, and international relations are proving practical and sustainable. This realization terrifies Western establishments because it challenges the core of their identity. If American hegemony is not predestined, if Western values are not universal, and if other civilizations can chart independent courses, then what justifies ongoing dominance? Increasingly, the answer is nothing. This recognition is pushing Western foreign policy toward progressively desperate actions. As a security scholar, this is what alarms me the most. Powers in decline often resort to military force when economic influence falters. History repeatedly demonstrates that fading empires frequently choose war rather than accept reduced status. The likelihood of armed conflict rises as economic tools lose their potency. Sachs proposes an alternative, which he calls cooperative multipolarity. Instead of resisting inevitable change, the West could embrace it, participating in the construction of international institutions that mirror new realities rather than clinging to structures designed for a world that no longer exists. Such an approach demands humility, a quality American leadership has rarely exhibited. It entails recognizing that other nations have legitimate interests, that diverse models of development can succeed, and that variation in governance does not threaten global stability. The alternative is ongoing confrontation, economic fragmentation, and the escalating risk of conflict between nuclear powers. As Sachs warns, the old order is collapsing regardless of whether we try to steer it or not. The pressing question is whether we navigate this transition wisely or stumble into disaster. Russia's durability has exposed the limitations of Western economic dominance. Sanctions meant to showcase American power have instead highlighted its constraints. Globally, nations are drawing conclusions that will reshape international relations for generations. The tragic dynamics of great power politics are playing out once again. But this time, the declining hegemon is ourselves. The real question is no longer whether we will adapt to multipolarity. It is whether we will do so through cooperation or through the chaos that typically accompanies the collapse of empires. Professor Sachs has issued his warning. How we respond remains our choice, but time is rapidly slipping away, and the world continues to move forward with or without American consent. The era of uncontested dominance is over. What comes next remains uncertain, but the trajectory is unmistakable, and the stakes could not be higher.